On Sunday, December 7th of 1941, at 7:55 a.m., the paradisiacal Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, was thrown into chaos. The Japanese, allies of Germany and the despicable Adolf Hitler, bombed Pearl Harbor in hopes of destroying America's Air Force, or planes. This was a huge insult to the United States, and they showed their anger by joining the war, which they had previously been avoiding. But something that many people don't know is that the U.S. government retaliated against the Japanese not just by dropping the atom bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but also by placing the Japanese Americans into internment camps. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was unjustified due to the racial stereotyping that was present. You may be thinking, how did they manage to get all the Japanese Americans into internment camps? We know what you mean. It does sound confusing and practically impossible, especially considering the fact that thousands of Japanese immigrants had come to the U.S. over the past 40 to 50 years. But with the signing of Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, all Japanese Americans were commanded to relocate to the designated internment camps. As a result, roughly 120,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry were forced from their homes to live in small, overcrowded barracks. The U.S. government relocated the Japanese Americans due to what they called national security, but in truth, it was really because they didn't trust them, even those who had been born in the U.S. or who had lived there for the large majority of their lives. Japanese Americans were forced to leave behind their families and friends, businesses and homes, and all because of their race or their father's race and his father before him. If that isn't racist, then I don't know what is. And over 2/3, or approximately 70,000, of the Japanese Americans interned were American citizens. According to an article about the Executive Order 9066, quote, Japanese Americans and other Asians in the U.S. had suffered decades from prejudice and racially motivated fear. Laws preventing Asian Americans from owning land, voting, testifying against whites in court, and other racially discriminatory laws existed long before World War II. End quote. From this quote, we can determine that Japanese Americans had never really held a place of trust in the hearts of the white Americans, and that the bombing of Pearl Harbor really just set into motion an uproar of racial hate and distrust. However, despite the hate and fear that was aimed at Japanese Americans, an estimated 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the U.S. military during and immediately after World War II. Japanese Americans served in the 100th Infantry Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, U.S. Air Force, and Military Intelligence Service. The fact that many Japanese Americans served for the U.S., their new home in World War II, proves their allegiance to the United States. If the government would trust them to preserve and fight for the U.S., then why shouldn't they trust them to be simply citizens? According to their line of logic, the Japanese Americans in service would have an equal, if not greater likelihood, chance of rebelling against the U.S. and switching sides to fight for their quote-unquote home, land, and people. Clearly, a great deal of racial prejudice was present in the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II due to their ethnic background. Picture this. Because of the color of your skin, the shape of your facial features, and where your family is from, you and your family are forced to leave everything behind and move into a quarantine of sorts. Your quarters are minute, cold, and not at all like your real home. You and your family and the other people with you are kept under watch. The children playing outside can only go so far before they face the barbed wire fences that are meant to keep them in and others out. This is what happened to the Japanese Americans when the people of the land of the free, so to speak, decided that they were untrustworthy due to their racial background. At the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government and citizens decided that the resident Japanese Americans were untrustworthy because they and/or their families were from Japan. Their fear is understandable, considering the fact that the Japanese are the ones that attacked them. But going so far as to put anyone and everyone that looked even a little bit Japanese into internment camps, that's way too far. Another interesting tidbit about the Japanese American internment camps is that within the camps, certain classes were established. As an immigrant from Japan to North America, you were considered Issei, which simply meant that you were fresh off the boat, so to speak. If you were born in North America but your parents were immigrants from Japan or Issei, then you would be considered a Nisei, which means that your parents are or were immigrants, but that you were born in the U.S. If you were born in the U.S. and your grandparents were or are Japanese immigrants, and you were born in the U.S., then you would be called a Sansei, which means that your grandparents were Japanese immigrants and you were born in the U.S. Within the internment camps, Sansei were the most trusted. They were allowed certain privileges and more chances to prove their devotion to the U.S. and its safety. Nisei were also allowed more privileges, although not as many as the Sansei. The Issei were trusted the least out of the three ranks. The fact that the social classes of the Japanese American internment camps further proves the fact that the internment of the Japanese Americans was racist. Basically, the longer you had lived in the U.S., or the more quote-unquote Americanized you became, the more trust you would receive. The irony in this is that many of the Issei, those who were of the first generation, had lived in the U.S. for just as long as many of the Nisei or Sansei. In conclusion, the more American a Japanese American was, the more the government or white people trusted them.
Another reason why the shameful thing that the Americans had set up was unjustified was because of how it was cruel and made more and more people fear the government, where that fear continues today. This is evident in the fact that it gave the Japanese Americans a reason to fight, just to prove their loyalty to the U.S. Approximately 33,000 people with Japanese backgrounds fought for the U.S. during World War II, with around 800 of them dying while in battle. They also worked as translators and other positions that were useful to the government. Most of these people only fought in the war to support their families back at the camps rather than to help the country they live in. In the camps they were put into, there was barbed wire surrounding their camps, and if any of them were caught trying to sneak out, they would be shot. They lived in small barracks with several other families and no privacy. It acted less as a resettlement community and more of a prison. They were put into situations where it would almost force them to want to leave the place and fight for America. They were forced to leave their homes and their lives, not able to bring any of their own possessions and losing all of their jobs, interrupting the business community. Many Japanese Americans were forced to walk away from their lives just because of the distrust of the government. In modern-day America, this would be frowned upon. The way that the Americans had treated the Japanese Americans while they were both being put into the camps and also while they were in there shows how the internment camps were just showing the racism of the 1940s Americans, because they were stereotyping the fact that all the Japanese Americans were against them and that they all deserved to be treated in the way a traitor would be treated. They were ripped from their lifestyles and put into likely worse situations where they had no privacy and they were not allowed to leave, just like how prisoners or spies would be treated, and this was all just because of their racial background. Almost none of the people they put into the camps actually had anything to do with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and yet they were all paying the price for it because of America's tendency to stereotype and divide. They all had no right to do any of this to any of the Japanese Americans they had in prison.